Hi everybody and welcome back to the channel. In this video we are going to be taking a look at the mask modifiers. We're going to look at the curvature mask component, and we're also going to design this material that you're seeing here on screen. This material is composed by some patterns that we made with the mask and some of the Megascans. Alright, let's get started. Okay, what I have here is a brand new file so you guys can follow along. We're starting from scratch. And for this, you're going to need a couple of things if you want to download them beforehand. These are the Megascans that we're going to be using. So if you want to download them right now, you can go and make sure you're in Surface and look for Worn Concrete. It's this one right here. And the other one that we're going to be using is Rock Wall. It's this one right here. And the last one's going to be Dirty Concrete Floor. It's right here. All right, now that you've downloaded all of those, what we're going to do is we are going to bring them in here. So I'm going to bring my rock wall. Okay, so what I did is I brought them off by clicking on add surface layer. So once you download them, make sure you add surface layer and you'll be able to browse them into your local library. Okay, before we start doing our material, I'm going to talk a little bit about components so you can understand it a little bit better. And for that, I'm just going to be using a solid layer and we're going to add a mask. If you're brand new to Quixel Mixer, I'm going to leave a playlist link in the comments down below. And the video before this is usually in the description down below as well. So I'm just going to add let's just add a noise. Simple purling noise. All right, and in order to see what's going on, I'm actually going to go to number 9 and let's increase the threshold of this so you can actually see. Okay, so this is a regular noise. We already know about this. We already know about all the patterns, but there's a couple of things that we didn't touch on last week, which was the mask modifiers. So the mask modifiers are these right here. There are various that we're going to be using today to create the material. Some of them we're going to leave them for later. All right, so let's start with brightness and contrast. Brightness and contrast, self-explanatory. You use the slider to increase or decrease the brightness, and you use this to give more contrast. Contrast will be the difference between the two colors. So if I increase the contrast, you see that the white and black spots are more visible than before. So this is what it's doing. And if I go back to my PBR mode, you can see what's going on here. So let me go back to my mask. If you decrease the contrast, you're going to see that that's a lot more blurry and it's not as pronounced as if I increase the contrast. So the closer the colors are to its limits, so let's say the limit is white and the lower limit is black, the closer they are to its limit, the sharper the step or the height it's going to be. And that's brightness and contrast. Let's just add another one called clamp. And what this do is this will give you a range between 0 and 1 in order for you to define the image that you're seeing here. So if I move the range over to this side, you're going to see that things get darker. And if I move the range over to this side, you're going to see that image gets wider. So the purpose of this is so you can get a definition of range that you want. And as you can see, the noise really changes just by using this feature. So this feature usually goes really well with brightness and contrast. So if I add brightness and contrast right now, I can actually tweak how this looks. And if we go to number 1, it actually looks like Swiss cheese. We can do various things with it. All right, so these two usually go great together. Now let's go back and let's keep looking at other components. Invert, very self-explanatory. It inverts everything. Now you're seeing that usually each component will have an invert toggle at the end. So what is the purpose of this? The purpose of this is, let's say you have a bunch of components here and you want to invert the whole stack as opposed to just inverting one, then you would use this modifier called invert. Now, if we keep going, we have normalize, which again will kind of define those colors a little bit, and it does something different depending on how much you have on screen. But normalize, pretty much what it does is it's kind of like give it a little bit of contrast, okay? And this is useful whenever you have a full stack. There'll be a better example down the road for this one. The other one is gradient remap. So what this does is it allows you to play with the gradient of your noise or whatever you have below. So you can see that it's like having clamp and another modifier here. So it's like having clamps, levels, and repeat here. And this can give you a nice stylized effect if you were looking for that. So that's why the gradient map, it's something that we'll be using later when we're doing stylized stuff. So you can do some nice modern art stuff here too. And let me get rid of that. Let's delete. Now let's see the next one. It's called Posterize. If I click on here, Posterize, what it does is it creates steps in between the colors. So the gradient, it's usually something very soft. What this will do is it will create like steps in between. Instead of softening the gradient, it will be like step 1, step 2, step 3, that kind of deal. This is also very good for stylizing, and you'll see me using this when I actually start stylizing the 3D Megascans. This is actually very useful for that. Now if we continue here, we have blur, and Gaussian blur is just your regular blur. You can increase the strength and make things a lot blurrier. Actually for this, let me just get a pattern in here. So I'm gonna get a pattern of squares, and we're gonna be using this one later on, but just to show you what's going on. We have a pattern of squares here, and you can see that there's a little bit of horrible shading here, and the reason for that is because this extrusion is so sharp. That's where the blur option comes into play. So we'll use Gaussian blur, and you're gonna see that it really softens that up. If I wanted to do my squares a little bit tighter, I can reduce that blur, but as you can see, that got rid of that horrible shading that I was having here from the displacement map. So this is a good note, and this is something that we'll be using to create this material. Now the next one is bevel. So very self-explanatory, and you're gonna say, well, we already have bevel here. Why are we gonna use this bevel? Well, the reason why we're gonna use this bevel is because if I were to use this bevel right here, you're gonna see that the beveling is very, very sharp, and you can see that in the mask that it has this kind of like tight white lines over here, whereas if I were to use the other bevel, you can see that it has very soft beveling in between. So that's the difference, and you're going to see me using this bevel as opposed to this one over here most of the time. So the next one is circular transform. This is very useful if you're trying to make something like this. So let's say if you were making like an altar or something like that made out of bricks, I'd say that's one of the uses that I would give this one. And you can play with this, the margins, make it bigger, smaller, repetitions. If you wanted to make more repetitions in between the bricks, swirl, if you want to make something like this. So as you can see, we have a lot of options to play with here, and the flipping, we'll flip the swirl from different angles. I think this is really cool. Now we have scatter, and scatter will work more like this if we were to add 1 and 1. Let's say, let me bring the spacing to something really high, all the way to 10. And actually, let's do 20. This is one property that we're going to use when we're constructing our material. If I were to, this is not the end of this value. You can input something like, let's say I input 40. You can see that it went all the way there, and now this is your new limit. So you can input whatever value you want here, and that will be your new limit for that. So the thing with scatter is, if I were to add scatter now, as you can see, what does scatter mean? It just scatters the square around, and this is really useful for when we are actually building some certain random details. So we don't have to go and stamp those ourselves. It actually repeats it for us and it kind of randomizes it for you, and you can adjust the angle and the brightness jitter, and it has some random seeds for you too. So this is something that's really nice to have. Now projection is what used to be transform. So as you can see, there is no longer, if you play with Mixer 2019, and if you see any tutorials from Mixer 2019, there used to be something called transform. It's no longer here. It's now called projection. So projection will have everything that transform had, and it will have a couple different things. So tiling, if you wanted to tile this, so let's say if I wanted to repeat it here, and for some reason, actually this is very useful. Sometimes you don't want to use the one from the pattern, you want to use this one. You have offset. Now the other thing that you could do is you can go freeform, and freeform will allow you to actually rotate here. We're actually going to be using this one. Will allow you to scale, and you can offset it. All right. Box projection is just another type of projection. It just projects it in sort of like a box type of deal. I don't like using this on planes because I think the box projection was meant for 3D assets. All right, that is it for the components, and let's start building our material. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to go and duplicate this, duplicate layer, and I'm going to turn this one on. I'm going to turn this one off. Gonna go back to PBR, and there's some adjustment that we need to do to this layer. So we go here, and you can see that this has a lot of displacement. Actually, I'm trying to build the floor out of this material, so I don't want this amount of displacement on my floor. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here into height frequency. This is usually like this, so just click the drop down, and I'm going to reduce the high frequency and the low frequency to kind of flatten this up a little bit. I don't want it super flat, I just want it a little bit flatter. Okay, that way when we're doing our extrusion, it's not gonna look all weird. And actually what I can do is I'm gonna delete this one and duplicate this one. Okay, now for this we're going to add a mask. We're going to create a pattern, square pattern, and we're going to do the repetition 6 by 6. Actually, another thing we should do is increase the threshold, maybe around here. All right, so let's say this is our inner pattern. What we need to do with this inner pattern in order for us to achieve that material that I showed you in the beginning, I actually want this to be angular as sort of like a transformation. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a component, and I'm going to add projection. In projection, I'm going to switch to freeform, and I'm going to rotate 45 degrees. There you go. And now what I'm going to do is, in order to define that center, I'm going to add another pattern. So in here, you're going to see that I'm stacking masks one on top of each other, and you can stack a ton of masks, as I said last time. So what I'm going to do is go here and add another pattern, square. This pattern is going to be 1 by 1. And we're going to give it a ton of space. I'm going to start working with my mask a little bit more so I can actually see what's going on as opposed to just seeing the material. So I'm going to press number 9 on my keyboard. That will take me to my layer mask. And the spacing for this one's going to be 30. Whoops, 30, not 130. By 30. Okay, this will define my center. And if I were to go back, you're gonna see that I can only see my center, but now I'm no longer seeing my pattern. So that is when our blending modes come into play. We didn't talk about blending modes before. The blending modes is what you're going to get in this drop down menu right here. So if I were to click on normal, and by the way, normal doesn't mean normal map or face, it means without a blending mode. The other thing is, for a blending mode to work, you're going to need more than one stack. because if you don't have more than one, then there's nothing to blend. What I'm going to use here is the multiply blending mode. The multiply, what it does, if I switch to mine, is it's going to multiply the colors, in this case the blacks and the whites. So what multiply does theoretically, and most of these are mathematical operations, multiply does the multiplication, so black will equal 0, so anything multiplied by 0 will be 0. That means that anything that's black or very close to black will probably turn into black. Anything that's multiplied by 1 will be that same number, so that means that anything that's multiplied by white will remain the same color. If I use it, you'll see what I mean. So if I click here, you're gonna see that I can now see my pattern from before. So the blacks are getting black with this and the whites are getting shown. All right, that's what multiply does. And if I go back to my PBR, I'm seeing that now I got my pattern very nice and oblique, but I still have this weird shading that I don't like on the side. So in order to get rid of this, we are going to need a Gaussian blur like I used in the beginning. So I'm going to go here. So my Gaussian blur is actually on top of this pattern. I'm gonna go here and select Gaussian blur. We didn't talk about directional blur, but directional blur, it's very specific, so I'll talk about it later on when I'm building another material. So right now this is looking kind of pillowy and I want it to look very sharp, so I'm just going to bring the strength down to maybe 0.02. And what I'm going to do, and this is something that you'll be able to do with any component, is you can right click, copy component. I'm gonna go upstairs and right click here, paste as new. And as you can see, that helped me erase all the bad shading that was going on over there. All right, so now we have the inside, but what about the outside of the material? That's what we're going to do with this one over here. We're just going to kind of invert what we have here. So I'm actually going to turn off this layer. I'm going to turn this one on, and let's see what we can do. We'll probably turn this one just so we can figure out the threshold. So let's say we want this one a little bit higher. Okay, that's what I want. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm actually going to take the albedo and bring it down to kind of like a reddish color. Okay, this will help you change the tint of your albedo. Remember that you always need to have a visible layer in order to add a mask. So I'm actually going to turn on this one and I'm going to add my mask stack here. Go back to my mask face and we're going to add a pattern. We're going to add a square pattern and we're going to do 6 by 6. We're also going to add another pattern. For this one, we're not going to add a projection because I want this to be the border. So we're going to add another pattern, square, and this is going to be 1, 1. Spacing is going to be 30 by 30. And what we're going to do with this one is we're going to invert. Okay, and for that we're going to be using the multiply again, and there you can see quickly my pattern from underneath. Now all we have to do is add our blur, and because I copied it from before, I can just paste it here as new and paste it here as well. Okay, so you can see that really helps with the shading. Okay, now I'm gonna get out of mask, and you can see that I have some very nice looking squares all around. I'm actually going to turn this off, turn this on, and there you go. See, that was really nice and quickly. Actually, I'm just going to do something so this looks a little bit better. Let me just go here into my pattern and reduce the spacing to 0.5. I'm actually going to select that, Control C, Control V here. Gonna do the same thing on top. Control V, Control V. There you go. Yeah, that's so it's not as separated. The other thing that I'm going to do to this pattern is I'm going to add a little bit of jitter. so it doesn't look like it's been machined. Usually when you see tiles laid around, they are not laid 100% completely flat, especially when it's like this is like an outside floor that looks really worn. So we want to convey that. So I'm going to go with brightness jitter. I'm actually going to go to my mask so I can see what's going on, and I'm going to play with the amount. So I'm going to reduce the amount a little bit, like around here. And I'm also going to use a gradient jitter. I think that's too much. We're just going to bring them up a little bit. Yeah, I don't want it too exaggerated. I just want to add a little bit of variation to them. So I'm going to go back here to this one as well, and I'm going to turn on the jitter, brightness jitter. And you can play this however you want, be as creative as you want. I'm just doing this in case you want to follow along, but feel free to play with all these settings to get your own personalized material. So I'm going to do the gradient jitter. All right, nothing too fancy. Just gonna go back to 1, and as you can see, I now have like different parts of the tile. And the last thing that I want to add to this, so it looks a little bit more realistic, it's a little bit of concrete in between. So there's nothing right now that's going through, and I just want to add some concrete in between that. What I'm gonna go and do is I'm gonna increase this threshold. There you go. And what we're gonna do, this actually looks fine. If you want to leave it at that, I would say that's up to you. I think this looks fine, but I also want to show you the curvature mask, which we haven't talked about yet. So if I were to go to my mask stack and I go to my component, you're gonna see there's a curvature component that we haven't talked about. I'm gonna use that here. So if I click on that, you're gonna see that it kind of went away. It's not doing much, but what I need to do is go into my mask, and this is how the curvature works. It will detect all the edges and all the cavities. That's what default curvature does. However, I want to detect the cavities only for this one. You can detect the edges, and this is also very good if you want to add something worn to the edges. But in this case, I just want this concrete to be kind of like what's in between this. And what I'm seeing here is that this concrete is a little bit too raised. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the levels to play with that. So I'm going to make it kind of like this way. I think this is still too high. So another thing that we could do is we can actually add another component, add a clamp those values a little bit lower by diminishing this range. And if we go back to our material, you can see that that concrete's actually filling our edges. All right, you can see the difference if I turn it on and off. Now we have a little bit of concrete that's going through, and I think this is a little bit sharp. So what I'm going to go here, I'm going to add a blur, Gaussian. Let me actually look at my mask to see what's going on. This may be a little bit too much. So I want it to be tight, but not too tight. Maybe this will allow us to play with our clamp a little bit more. There you go. All right, so we now have some nice concrete flowing through the cracks and the crevices. You can keep on adding more to this if you want. Maybe duplicate this layer and put it on top. Maybe somebody was going through with a little bit of concrete over this and forgot to clean it up. But this is pretty much a simple material that you can make on your own if you want to practice how to create your own materials within Quixel Mixer by using the Megascans as well. Alright everyone, that was it for this video. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, please leave a like. It really helps the channel. If you want a tutorial on a specific material, please let me know on the comments down below. Please share this video around, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.